The road to the valley was a pale, dusty ribbon worn into the earth by wagon wheels and time. It wound through silent hills that seemed to hold their breath, leading ever onward to a place the young woman in the rattling cart knew only from a few lines on a paper and the grim finality in her father's eyes. Her name was Lily, and her world, which had once been the cramped confines of a struggling farmhouse, had shrunk further still to the few possessions she could clutch in a worn leather bag. The bag sat on her lap now, a poor anchor against the vast, rolling unknown. The ranch announced itself first as a scent on the wind, clean, dry hay, the rich tang of earth, and beneath it, the warm, living smell of animals. Then came the sight of a wooden fence, stretching farther than she could see, marking a kingdom of green and gold grass. The wagon creaked to a halt before a heavy gate, crowned with a simple arch of weathered timber. Beyond it stood the house. It was not grand, but sturdy and plain, built from logs that spoke of quiet strength. Smoke curled from its chimney, a soft gray line against the immense blue bowl of the sky. It was a lonely picture, beautiful in its way, but so terribly quiet. It was that quiet which made the opening of the front door sound so loud. And then he filled it. Lily's breath caught, a small, sharp sound lost in the valley's breeze. The man who stepped onto the porch was not merely tall, he was a monument of a man. The doorframe, which would have allowed any ordinary fellow to pass with ease, seemed to shrink as he ducked his head beneath it. He straightened, and his height was such that the porch roof shadowed his brow. His shoulders were like boulders beneath a faded shirt, his arms long and thick, ending in hands that looked capable of shaping the world itself. This was Garrick, the cowboy to whom her hand had been promised. The words on the paper had not prepared her. He was a giant, carved from the very landscape. He moved down the steps with a surprising, ground-covering grace, his boots making soft thuds on the hard-packed earth. The wagon driver, a man who had spoken little on the journey, gave a curt nod and set Lily's single bag on the ground before flicking the reins, leaving her there as if delivering a parcel. She stood, feeling smaller than she ever had, a sapling before an oak. Garrick stopped a few paces away, and she saw his eyes for the first time. They were the color of a forest pool, deep-set under a strong brow, and they studied her not with a critic's coldness, but with a slow, careful attention that felt more physical than a touch. He saw her simple dress, mended at the sleeve. He saw the nervous way her fingers twisted together. He saw the wide, dark pools of her own eyes, filled with a fear she was trying desperately to swallow. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind in the grass and the distant lowing of a cow. Then, he stepped forward. He did not reach for her, but for the bag on the ground. His enormous hand, calloused and marked by labor, closed around the leather strap. He lifted it as if it held nothing but feathers. The sight of her humble belongings made tiny in his grasp was strangely poignant. "Come," he said, and his voice was like the rest of him, a low, quiet rumble that seemed to come from the earth. It was not unkind. He turned and walked toward the house, not checking to see if she followed, but moving with a certainty that she would. Lily's legs, feeling weak and foreign, carried her after him. Through the gate, along the path, up the steps he had to duck to climb again. The interior of the house was one main room, warm from the fire, dominated by a large stone hearth. A table, 2 chairs, a cupboard. A door leading to what must be a bedroom. Everything was scrupulously clean, orderly, and bare of any frippery. It was the home of a man who lived alone with his thoughts. Garrick set her bag down beside the table. He turned to face her, and in the confined space, his size was even more overwhelming. He seemed to absorb the light and the air. Lily found herself taking a small step back, her shoulder brushing the rough wood of the wall. He saw it. The movement was slight, but those watchful eyes missed nothing. A shadow, soft and somber, passed over his features. He did not move closer. Instead, he gestured slowly to the room, his large hand painting the space between them. "This is yours," he said, the words deliberate. "The house. The land. The sky here." He paused, and his gaze held hers with a force that was not violent, but inescapable. "You are safe. No one will hurt you here. That is my first promise to you." The words were simple, a vow made of plain timber and stone, like the house itself. They did not speak of love, or even of want. They spoke of duty, and of a profound, solitary honor. In them, Lily heard the truth of her new life. She was now part of this lonely kingdom, subject to its ruler, this quiet giant. The fear in her chest did not vanish, but it shifted, mixed with a spark of something else, a recognition of the raw, untamed power in his gentleness, and the first, faint tremor of curiosity about what such power might mean for her, here, at the edge of the world. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the window, and the silence of the valley settled around them, heavy with the unspoken beginning of everything. The dawn broke over the valley not with a shout, but with a slow, gentle washing of gold across the meadows. For Lily, waking in the narrow bed of the small room Garrick had given her, the first light revealed not the familiar, crowded walls of her childhood, but the clean, spare lines of a stranger's home. The silence was a living thing, filled only with the distant, muffled sounds of the ranch coming awake, the soft lowing of cattle, the creak of a gate, the solid, rhythmic tread of Garrick's boots on the porch below. It was a silence she had to learn to breathe in. He gave her space that first full day, a courtesy that felt as vast as the land outside. He moved through his chores with a steady, untroubled pace, a man in perfect accord with the demands of his domain. Lily watched him from the window, a giant moving among smaller creatures, his motions efficient and powerful. He did not ask anything of her, yet his quiet expectancy was a presence in the house as tangible as the table or the hearth. She understood that to earn her place here, she must learn its rhythms. The next morning, she rose early, dressed, and met him at the door as he was about to leave. She did not speak, only looked up at him, her hands clasped tightly before her. Garrick looked down at her for a long, quiet moment, those deep-set eyes reading the resolve in her small, upturned face. A nod, almost imperceptible, was his only answer. He led her outside into the crisp morning air. The lessons were simple, physical things. He showed her how to latch the heavy gate so it would not swing open in the wind. Her hands, small and pale, struggled with the thick iron mechanism. Without a word, he stepped close behind her. His body did not touch hers, but she felt the heat of him, a wall of solid warmth at her back. Then his hand enveloped hers, completely, his fingers wrapping around her fist and the cold metal. He guided the movement, his strength making the difficult task effortless. Like this, his voice murmured by her ear, a low vibration she felt in her bones. His touch was not soft, his skin was rough and weathered, but it was infinitely careful, as if she were made of the most delicate glass. When the latch clicked home, he did not immediately release her. They stood for a heartbeat, her hand still lost in his, before he stepped back, the morning chill rushing into the space where he had been. In the barn, he taught her to measure out grain for the horses. The sack was taller than she was, and the wooden scoop was large and clumsy in her grip. He watched her struggle for a moment, then simply lifted the entire sack as if it were a pillow, holding it steady for her. He let her do the work, his immense patience a scaffold around her fumbling efforts. When a few golden kernels spilled onto the dusty floor, she flinched, expecting reproach. He merely bent, his large frame folding with surprising grace, and gathered them into his palm before offering them back to her scoop. No waste. No anger. only a quiet, practical communion with the things that sustained life here. It was in the quiet of the late afternoon, in the main room of the house, that the lesson shifted. He had asked her to fetch a jar of honey from a high shelf in the cupboard. She stretched on her toes, her fingertips brushing the lowest wooden board, far from her goal. She felt a flush of frustration, of smallness. Then he was there. He did not reach over her. Instead, he came up behind her, his shadow swallowing her own. His hands came to rest on the cupboard on either side of her, caging her gently between the wood and the immense heat of his body. She could feel the hard plane of his chest against her back, the strength of his thighs just behind her own. He leaned forward, his breath stirring the hair at her crown, and retrieved the jar with ease. But he did not move away. The air grew thick and still. The space around her was now entirely him, the scent of sun, leather, and clean sweat. She was held in a fortress of his making. His head dipped, and his lips were close to the shell of her ear when he spoke, the rumble of his voice a private thunder. "I'll stretch you till it fits, little one," he said, the words slow and deliberate, like honey pouring from the very jar in his hand. "Till this place, and I, feel just right for you." The meaning was strange, layered. It was not a threat of force, but a promise of adaptation, of a gentle, relentless molding. It spoke of a future where her smallness would not be a hindrance, but a fact he would forever account for, surrounding her, accommodating her, until the mismatch of their sizes became its own kind of perfect fit. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird, but it was not pure fear that made it beat so. It was the dawning, terrifying understanding of his intention. He would not simply let her live here, he would shape her world, and himself, to contain her. That understanding deepened with the evening's final ritual. He heated water on the great hearth and poured it into a copper tub before the fire. The steam rose in soft curls. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "The dust of the day does not belong in a clean bed," he stated, as if it were simple ranch law. With motions that held no hesitation, he began to undo the buttons of her dress. Her hands flew up to stop him, a gasp on her lips, but his eyes met hers, and the calm certainty in them stilled her protest. This was not an assault, but a ceremony. He undressed her as one might unwrap a precious gift, each layer revealed with slow care. When she stood bare and shivering before him, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing and placed her in the warm water. Then, kneeling on the hard floor beside the tub, this giant of a man took up a soft cloth and a bar of soap. He began to wash her. His touch was methodical, reverent. The rough pads of his fingers traced the delicate lines of her shoulders, the slope of her back, the slender length of her arms. He washed the dust from her neck, lathered the cloth and smoothed it over her stomach, his hand broad enough to span it completely. He was thorough, leaving no part of her untouched, yet his dominance was clothed in such exquisite tenderness that her initial shame began to melt away, replaced by a profound, liquid warmth that had little to do with the water. He rinsed her with a pitcher, the clean water cascading over her skin. As he lifted her from the tub, wrapping her in a blanket of rough, clean linen, she was pliant, her body and will softened by the fire's heat and the shock of his care. He carried her to the chair by the hearth, where he sat with her in his lap, cradled against the solid wall of his chest, and combed the tangles from her damp hair with his fingers. She drifted in a haze, the last of her resistance stretched thin and finally dissolved. The giant had claimed his ground not through force, but through an unwavering, tactile patience. And Lily, wrapped in warmth and the scent of him, began, secretly and deeply, to crave the confines of the world he was so deliberately building around her. The peace of the valley was a living, breathing thing, but it was not a gentle peace. It was the peace of immense spaces and primal forces, and it could turn, as it did on the third week of Lily's new life, into a roaring, elemental fury. The storm gathered its strength in the afternoon, the sky bruising from a clear blue to a sickly, greenish gray. By dusk, the first wind arrived, not as a breeze but as a gale that screamed around the corners of the house, making the heavy timbers groan in protest. Then came the rain, a sudden, deafening torrent that hammered on the roof like 1,000 frantic fists. But it was the lightning that truly undid Lily, great, jagged forks of white fire that split the world apart, followed by cracks of thunder so deep and violent they shook the ground beneath the floorboards. In her small, dark room, Lily curled into a tight ball beneath her quilt. Each flash illuminated the bare walls in a stark, terrifying tableau. Each boom felt like it would shatter the very logs of the house. She was a city of fear, and the storm laid siege to every wall. The loneliness she had been slowly carving into a home now gaped open, a yawning chasm of terror. She was a child again, but with no mother's voice to soothe her, no crowded bed to share the fright. She was alone, save for the giant in the other room. The thought of him was a sudden, solid anchor in the chaos. Without conscious decision, her feet found the cold floor. The main room was lit only by the desperate, leaping flames in the hearth. There, in his large chair, sat Garrick. He was not sleeping. He sat perfectly still, watching the storm through the window as if it were a mildly interesting spectacle, his profile a craggy mountain range against the firelight. He turned his head as she emerged, a small, trembling ghost in her white nightdress, her eyes wide with reflected lightning. He did not speak. He simply held out one hand, palm up, in a silent command that was also an invitation. It was not a gesture that could be refused. Lily crossed the room, the wooden floor icy under her bare feet, and placed her tiny hand in his. His fingers closed around it, warm and complete, and he drew her to him. He did not pull her onto his lap. Instead, he stood, his immense height seeming to push back the raging night outside, and led her, wordlessly, to his own bedchamber. The room was Spartan, dominated by a bed that seemed as large as a small boat, framed in heavy, dark wood. The blankets were thick wool and rough-spun linen. He released her hand only to pull back the covers. He nodded toward the space. Obeying an instinct deeper than fear, Lily climbed in, sinking into the feather mattress that still held the imprint and warmth of his body. He blew out the single candle, plunging the room into a darkness broken only by the erratic flashes from the window. She heard the rustle of his clothes, the creak of the floorboards, and then the bed dipped profoundly under his weight as he lay down beside her. For a long moment, there was only the storm and the shared heat under the blankets. Then, he turned onto his side, facing her. In the next flash of lightning, she saw his eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on her. His arm, heavy and solid as a timber, came over her, drawing her back against him until her spine fitted into the curve of his body, her head tucked beneath his chin. She was enveloped, swallowed whole by his heat and his scent. The thunder crashed again, but this time, she felt it absorbed by the massive chest pressed against her back. He was a fortress against the storm. "You belong here," he said into her hair, his voice a low rumble that competed with the thunder and won. The words were not a question, nor a suggestion. They were a decree, as factual as the existence of the mountains. His hand, which had been resting on her arm, began to move. It was a slow, deliberate exploration, a cartographer mapping undiscovered country. His rough palm slid down her side, over the curve of her hip, and back up along the narrow ridge of her ribs. Through the thin fabric of her nightdress, his touch was a brand of possession, but it was a claiming that somehow soothed the last of her tremors. His hand found the hem of the shift and slipped beneath it, meeting the bare, cool skin of her thigh. Lily gasped, a small intake of breath lost in the howl of the wind. His touch was inexorable. His large hand glided upward, over the dip of her waist, the plane of her stomach, until his palm came to rest, warm and heavy, over one small, tender breast. His thumb stroked across the peak, and a bolt of sensation, entirely separate from the lightning outside, jolted through her core. He bent his head, and his lips found the sensitive place where her neck met her shoulder. The scratch of his beard, the heat of his mouth, it was a new kind of storm, brewing inside the safe harbor of his embrace. He asked no questions with words. His questions were posed with pauses, with the stillness of his hand waiting on her skin. When her breathing hitched, not in fear but in bewildered arousal, he took it as his answer. He turned her gently onto her back, looming over her in the dark. With patient, unhurried movements, he drew the nightdress over her head and cast it aside. The cool air touched her skin, followed immediately by the scorching heat of his gaze and his hands. He looked his fill, tracing every line and curve with his calloused fingertips, as the firelight and lightning painted her nakedness in fleeting, golden flashes. When he undressed, she saw the full, powerful reality of him, a silhouette of formidable strength and restrained need. He returned to her, settling between her thighs, which parted for him not out of conscious thought, but from a deep, instinctual yielding. He was careful, so careful, as he guided himself to her. He spoke then, his voice thick and strained with the effort of his control. "Look at me, Lily." She forced her eyes open, meeting his in the gloom. "It will only hurt for a moment. Then it will be us. Only us." The stretch was profound, an impossible, burning fullness that made her cry out, her nails digging into the hard muscles of his arms. He held himself perfectly still, a statue of tension, letting her body adjust to the shock of his invasion. He dropped his forehead to hers, his breath hot and ragged. "Little one," he murmured, a prayer and an endearment. Then, with a slowness that was its own form of agony and ecstasy, he began to move. The pain did not vanish, but it changed, transforming under the rhythm he established, a rhythm as old as the hills outside. It melted into a deep, aching pressure, a friction that sparked something in her depths she never knew existed. He filled her completely, a joining that felt less like an act and more like a fundamental truth being revealed. She was made for this containment, he was made to provide it. His thrusts were measured, powerful, each one a deliberate claiming of the space he had promised to make for her. She was stretched, yes, but she was also anchored, grounded to the earth by the weight and might of him. The storm outside faded to a distant echo, unimportant next to the tempest they were creating together in the warm, dark cocoon of his bed. It was a strange, bewildering alchemy, a melting of fear into surrender, of pain into a piercing, sweet sensation that coiled tight in her belly. When his control finally fractured, a low groan torn from his chest as he spilled into her, Lily felt not conquered, but discovered. He collapsed beside her, gathering her shaking form back into the fortress of his arms, and in the sudden, quiet aftermath, broken only by the calming rain, she knew nothing would ever be the same. The bridge between innocence and experience had been crossed, and it was he who had carried her, gently and irrevocably, to the other side. The world after the storm was reborn in a wash of crystalline light and dripping emerald leaves. The air itself tasted new. And so too, it seemed, did Lily. She woke in the great bed, still held fast in the circle of Garrick's arms, and the feeling that rose in her was not shame or regret, but a quiet, humming astonishment. Her body remembered the night, a deep, pleasant soreness, a feeling of having been profoundly used and, in that using, somehow made more real. She shifted, and the arm around her tightened, a wordless acknowledgement that he was awake and that she was still, unquestionably, his. The days that followed were painted in new colors. Where before she had moved through the ranch's routines with the hesitant steps of a visitor, she now walked with a nascent sense of ownership. This was her home, her land, her giant. The chores they shared became a silent, fluid dance. When she reached for a tool, his hand was already there, offering it. When she strained to lift a bucket, he would take it from her, his fingers brushing hers, a spark passing between them that had nothing to do with the task at hand. The careful distance he had once maintained was gone, replaced by a constant, low-grade physical awareness. His touch became more frequent, more possessive, a large hand resting at the small of her back as she passed him, a thumb stroking the sensitive skin of her inner wrist as he took a cup from her, a kiss pressed to the crown of her head as he found her kneading bread at the table. Each touch was a quiet reaffirmation of the covenant forged in the thunder. She began to watch him with new eyes. She studied the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt as he split wood, the powerful flex of his back, the sweat that darkened the fabric. The sight stirred not just admiration, but a low, pulling heat in her own belly. She found herself contriving reasons to be near him, to brush against him, to elicit that rumbling, approving hum from his chest. The innocence that had cloaked her was slipping away, not torn but willingly shed, revealing a woman who was beginning to understand the nature of the power she lived beside, and her own desire to summon it. One afternoon, the sun was a heavy, golden weight in the sky. Lily was in the high meadow, gathering wildflowers that grew in a sun-dappled clearing. Garrick had been mending a fence line nearby. She felt his approach before she saw him, a change in the air, a subtle darkening of the light as his shadow fell over the blossoms in her hands. She looked up, meeting his gaze. There was a new intensity there, a hunger less guarded than before. He said nothing. He simply took the flowers from her hands and let them fall, a scatter of color on the grass. His eyes never left hers as he lowered himself to his knees before her, bringing his face level with her stomach. His hands, broad and warm, settled on her hips, holding her in place. Here, under the open, arching sky, the dynamic shifted. The patient teacher, the gentle initiator, was joined by a more primal version of the man. He pulled her closer, his face pressing against her abdomen, his breath hot through her dress. His hand slid down to cup the backs of her thighs, then he lifted her as if she were weightless, laying her down upon the soft, thick carpet of grass and clover. The sun warmed her skin, the earth cradled her back. He loomed above her, blocking out the sky, his expression one of raw, undisguised need. "Tell me," he commanded, his voice rough. "Tell me you are mine." The words were not a question, but a demand for her voice, her will, to align with the truth his body already knew. And she wanted to give it. The last vestige of shyness burned away in the heat of his gaze. "I am yours," she whispered, and then, finding a new courage, "and you are mine." A fierce, approving light flashed in his eyes. This was not the tender claiming of the stormy night. This was a taking under the sun, a celebration of possession. He made love to her there in the grass with a driven, relentless passion. His kisses were deeper, his hands more insistent, mapping her body with a frantic ownership. He entered her in one smooth, powerful surge, and Lily cried out, not in pain, but in pure, shocking pleasure. The soreness was gone, replaced by a slick, desperate welcome. He moved within her, each thrust a declaration, and she met him, her hips rising, her own hands clutching at the hard muscles of his shoulders, learning the rhythm of his desire. She discovered, in that sunlit field, the intoxicating power of her own surrender. Her gasps, her moans, the way her body clenched around him, they were not just reactions, but commands that drove him further, that made the careful control he usually wielded begin to splinter. She learned to touch him in turn, her small hands exploring the hard planes of his chest, tracing the ridges of his stomach, venturing lower to grip the powerful column of his thigh. When her fingers brushed a certain spot on his neck, he groaned, a deep, shuddering sound of pure pleasure. She had found a key. She used it again, and felt him shudder, his rhythm faltering. In that moment, she understood her own strength. She could make the giant tremble. She could unravel him. Their loving became a language, a dialogue of gasps and sighs and tangled limbs. It happened in their bed at night, slow and deep and drowsy. It happened against the wall in the barn one rainy morning, frantic and breathless. It happened by the firelight, with her astride him, learning to set the pace, watching his face contort with ecstasy as she took her own pleasure from him. The stretching was no longer an adjustment to pain, but an eager reaching for a pinnacle of feeling that seemed to expand every time they joined. She craved the weight of him, the scent of him, the moment of delicious, helpless fullness. Her world, which had once been so vast and frightening, had beautifully, perfectly, shrunk to the space occupied by his body. And in that space, she was not small. She was essential, the spark that ignited the tinder of his immense strength, the one who could whisper more or now or yes and turn her quiet giant into a force of nature, utterly and wonderfully her own. The turning of the seasons in the valley was a slow, grand wheel, measured not by pages torn from a calendar but by the deepening gold of the grasses, the thickening of the animals' coats, and the way the evening chill began to linger long into the morning. Lily moved through these changes not as a spectator, but as a part of the landscape itself, her rhythms now inextricably woven with the land and the man who ruled it. The sharp edges of newness had been worn smooth by time and touch, replaced by a profound, unshakable familiarity. She knew the exact sound of Garrick's footfall on the porch, the particular way he sighed in his sleep, the feel of every scar that mapped his hands. He, in turn, knew the tiny freckle just below her left shoulder blade, the way she hummed when she was content, the precise pressure that made her arch against him in the dark. One evening, as the sun bled crimson and purple behind the distant hills, Garrick led her outside after their supper. They stood together at the fence line, looking out over the land that was now truly theirs. The silence between them was no longer empty, but rich and full, a shared language of presence. From his pocket, he drew a small object that caught the dying light. It was a bracelet, fashioned from a single, slender band of hammered silver, simple and sturdy yet delicate in its workmanship. He took her left wrist, his fingers encircling it with a gentleness that never ceased to amaze her, and fastened the clasp. It fit perfectly, a cool, bright circle against her skin. "A good silversmith understands the giving of metal," he said, his voice a low murmur in the twilight. "It must be heated, shaped. It must be stretched to its new purpose." His thumb stroked over the silver, then the pulse point beneath it. "You have done that to me, Lily. You have stretched my heart till it fits you. You filled a space I didn't know was empty." The words settled over her, warmer than any blanket. They were the final translation of his strange, early promise. It had never been about bending her to his will, but about the mutual transformation wrought by need and care. Her smallness had stretched the confines of his solitary heart, his vastness had stretched the boundaries of her world, and in that shared tension, they had found a perfect, unbreakable fit. She looked up at him, her eyes bright, and saw the truth of it in his face. The lonely giant was gone, replaced by a man whose depths had been plumbed and found worthy. That night, their coupling was different from all that had come before. It was a slow, tender ceremony of knowing. There were no frantic grabs, no hungry, wordless demands. He undressed her with a ritual slowness, kissing each new inch of skin revealed, the hollow of her throat, the inside of her elbow, the delicate knob of her ankle. She, in turn, removed his clothes with a confidence that spoke of ownership, her hands loving the familiar landscape of his body. When they joined, it was with a deep, sighing synchronicity, a homecoming. His movements were languorous, each stroke a whispered affirmation, each pause a moment to savor the connection. She wrapped her legs around him, drawing him deeper, not in desperate hunger, but in serene acceptance. Their eyes held in the dim light, communicating a universe of feeling that needed no clumsy words. This was the final, silent verse of their story, not a conquest, but a melding. When the peak came, it washed over them not as a crashing wave, but as a warm, rising tide, leaving them breathless and intertwined, their sweat-slicked skin proof of a union that was as much of the spirit as of the flesh. Afterward, he did not release her. He carried her, as he often did, to the chair by the hearth, settling into its embrace with her curled in the cradle of his lap. Her head rested on his shoulder, her silver-banded wrist lying over his heart. The fire painted them in shifting gold. She felt the steady, strong beat of him against her palm, a rhythm that had become the metronome of her life. She was accepted, not in spite of her smallness and her past, but because they were the very things that had made her the perfect key to his lonely kingdom. He was hers, utterly, and in his utter possession of her, she had found a freedom more complete than any she could have imagined on that first, fearful day at the gate. The next evening, they sat together on the porch step, her small hand swallowed in his enormous one. The valley before them stretched out, vast and peaceful in the twilight, a kingdom bathed in blue shadow and the promise of stars. Their future together felt as endless and fertile as that land, a story written not on paper, but in the seasons, in the crops they would grow, the animals they would raise, and the silent, powerful love that had grown, unexpected and unbreakable, between the giant and his petite bride. It was a story of finding where one belongs, and in the belonging, becoming whole. If you journeyed with Garrick and Lily through the vast, tender solitude of their valley, and found yourself moved by a love story that proves power can be gentle and innocence can be profound, then your next chapter awaits. Subscribe to our channel, Whispered Legends. We delve into timeless tales of unexpected romance, where passion is carved from the raw materials of fate and desire, and where happy ever-afters are earned in the most captivating ways. Join our community of listeners. A new story, just as immersive and heartfelt, is waiting to begin. Your adventure into the next grand, romantic epic is only a subscribe away.